If any of you have watched my videos for any length of time, you have probably noticed that amongst my many references to popular media, one film appears more than any other. It's a movie that stands as a titan in nuclear war media, and whose pedigree puts it in the running for one of the best comedy films ever made. It was directed by one of, if not the greatest director who ever sat behind a camera, whose obsessive focus on his art makes it simultaneously hilarious and downright terrifying. And it also happens to be the film that launched my own abiding interest in all things nuclear weapons. I am of course referring to Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. When I was about 12 years old, my dad rented Dr. Strangelove from the library, promising a funny old movie on a Sunday afternoon. And he was right. I was probably too young to understand the less blatant comedic undertones, but the bombastic General Ripper and the brilliant characters of Peter Sellers were enough to coax laughs out of my brother and I. But the scene that really stuck with me was the end of the film. And I won't blow that ending just yet, but it will suffice to say that the famous montage really made an impression. And what I definitely didn't realize at 12 years old was that I was not alone. Kubrick's film was not just a spoof comedy. It was a catalog of the fears of the director himself, but more importantly, of society at large when it came out in 1964. It's difficult to put oneself in the seat of a moviegoer in 1964 with the ubiquitous knowledge of the futility of nuclear war that we have now, but this was seriously pointed commentary for its day. Some called it anti-American, some said it was not a joking matter at all, but nobody ignored it. And even today, Dr. Strangelove remains Kubrick's highest-rated film on Rotten Tomatoes. So what is it about this movie that has made it a staple for nuclear history buffs and film lovers alike? Hey everyone, before we get into the action, I wanted to remind you that I do have a Patreon, so if you would like to support me more directly, you can find that link in the description and join the Stalwart 3 that have already started to support me. Thank you guys so very much. Be sure to leave a like and a comment, and please enjoy. There isn't much I can say about Stanley Kubrick that hasn't been said already. His filmography is a checklist for cinema snobs, with masterpieces like The Shining, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and A Clockwork Orange standing as giants in the film canon. Kubrick was a genius of film, seemingly touching every major genre and making eternal marks on each one. He's got The Shining for horror, Full Metal Jacket for war movies, 2001: A Space Odyssey for sci-fi, and more. He has certainly synthesized other genres in films like A Clockwork Orange, but only one of his movies is strictly a comedy, and that's Dr. Strangelove. Though it might not be surprising to learn that it wasn't originally meant to be funny. In fact, when Kubrick set out to make a movie about nuclear war, he wasn't laughing at all. Like many of us, Kubrick was utterly terrified of the prospect of atomic weapons, to the degree of paranoia. Kubrick is reported to have read as many as 50 books about nuclear war, nuclear weapons, and nuclear strategy. Impressive. In fact, Kubrick, a champion worrier, even considered moving he and his family out of their Manhattan apartment to the relatively safer Australia. He even visited Upside Down World and scouted it for locations to shoot his next film. This overwhelming concern of his was further amplified by the world-waking Cuban Missile Crisis, when America and the USSR threatened to utterly decimate each other in 1962. Of course, the balloon never went up, but the incident left Kubrick not as much afraid as depressed, utterly bereft that all of the Western world had blandly accepted that nuclear devastation was simply inevitable. The wheels for Dr. Strangelove had already been turning by this point, but the Cuban Missile Crisis was proof positive that something was needed to snap normal people out of their resigned acceptance. And so he started researching. A lot. In fact, those close to Kubrick claim that he became a veritable expert on the subject of nuclear war, atomic weapons, and the policies and strategies surrounding both. He even struck up an acquaintance with the venerable Herman Kahn, an early giant in the realm of nuclear thought. Kubrick read Kahn's book On Thermonuclear War cover to cover multiple times, and subsequently met with the author to discuss it. Kubrick also met with Nobel Prize-winning game theorist Thomas Schelling, and eventually with author Peter George. Peter George wrote a book published in 1952 called Red Alert, a fictional thriller based on his own experience as an RAF officer, a statement with some really frightening implications. That's because Red Alert tells the story of a rogue US Air Force general who launches a fraudulent nuclear strike against the Soviet Union.
Wait a minute!
George would have been aware of contingencies in place by nuclear powers in the event of a decapitation strike. That is, an attack that prevents the sitting executive from ordering a nuclear counterattack. Clearly, what concerned George was the relatively few barriers in place to prevent wing commanders from implementing such a response, whether it was needed or not. The truth of such a danger is something I've discussed before, particularly in my Broken Arrow series, but I will go over the US contingency plans later in this video. Peter George penned a compelling and truly terrifying novel in Red Alert, and his bona fides as an RAF officer added chilling credence to his narrative. Kubrick had now found the perfect framework to base his film on, so all that was left to do was write the screenplay and start production in earnest. But something happened when Kubrick started writing. He couldn't get deep into the research without laughing.
And there were times when it got to be well past midnight, and we started to get a little silly and a little giddy, and started to imagine what it would be like if all of these people in the war room with this terrible problem were hungry and had to eat. I mean, this is the silly stuff that we started to think about.
In fact, every time he'd start discussing the subject with anybody, he couldn't help but laugh at the sheer lunacy of it all. The reason for this is that when he would go to flesh out the details of a scene, he found himself wanting to leave out paradoxical and absurd realities in fear of seeming unbelievable. Things like MAD, overkill, and Herman Kahn's theoretical doomsday device were just too insane to take seriously. If you didn't know they were real, you'd think they were made up by L. Ron Hubbard. In addition, the perceived ease of access to nuclear weapons by relatively lower-level military personnel was understandably baffling to the director. When George told him how easy it would be for a nuclear attack to happen by mistake, Kubrick felt that a serious drama was now out of the question.
Kubrick realized that this stuff was so incredible that it could only be taken in and absorbed through a comic lens, through a satiric lens.
In order to bolster the comedic foundation of the story, Kubrick brought on Terry Southern, a controversial comedic author who gained fame from his books Candy and The Magic Christian. Candy, in particular, satirized modern sexuality in the mid-century, a fact that would be fairly pertinent to Dr. Strangelove, as we will see later. Once Kubrick decided on the comedic angle, the whole project began to crystallize into the farcical black comedy we know today. To that end, Kubrick was joined up with legendary funny man Peter Sellers of Pink Panther fame, originally slated to play 4 different roles in the movie. Other big names in the cast would be George C. Scott, snagging one of the 4 roles from Sellers as General Turgidson, Sterling Hayden as the paranoid General Jack D. Ripper, and Darth Vader himself, James Earl Jones, in his first major film role. Also in his first major role was rodeo performer Slim Pickens as Major Kong, probably the most recognizable man in nuclear media. Major Kong was another role that was first considered for Sellers, but the multi-talented actor was not confident enough in his southern accent to bring the character to life. And though co-writer Terry Southern helped Sellers better his impression, an accident on set that resulted in Sellers breaking his leg made it impossible for him to shoot the necessary scenes. So in the end, the natural choice was actual cowboy Slim Pickens.
What in the wide, wide world of sports is going on here?
Now, with a stellar cast, a tight script, and a thoroughly researched background, Dr. Strangelove was ready to bring the lunacy of nuclear war to the public. The film begins, hilariously enough, with a disclaimer requested by the actual US Air Force, reminding the viewer that the events portrayed in the film are fictional, and that there are safeguards in place to prevent what is about to be portrayed.
I believe them. Checks out to me.
What follows is a narrator's account of a persistent rumor, a rumor that claims that the Soviet Union has successfully built a massive weapon, a literal doomsday device, designed to trigger upon the slightest nuclear detonation on Russian soil. This, of course, is fiction.
Pure fiction.
But the next spiel from our narrator details the function and purpose of Strategic Air Command's Airborne Alert program. And this is mostly true. I've gone over Airborne Alert many times on this channel, and it was 100% real. The program saw constant flights of at least 4 B-52s over particular flight paths that would allow immediate ingress into Soviet airspace for the purpose of nuclear bombardment. The program was pioneered by channel favorite Curtis LeMay, who was convinced that the only way we could ensure a counterattack in the event of a Russian attack was to have constant nuclear-armed B-52s airborne at all times. More on this later. Next, we see General Jack D. Ripper ordering his swarthy English XO to order a red alert across US Air Force Base Burleson. Why? Because nuclear war is imminent, and it's time to implement Wing Attack Plan R. This plan is a contingency put in place in the event that the American president is unable to order a nuclear strike to counter the Soviets. The plan is dutifully communicated via coded message to the B-52 wing that is already airborne across the globe. And once received, these stalwart airmen jump into action, heading full speed ahead to targets within the Soviet Union. Ripper ensures Group Captain Mandrake that the attack is real, and that it is time to confiscate every personal radio device on the base and lock the whole facility down. Only, it's not real. The Russians haven't attacked, and the unhinged General Ripper has fraudulently issued the order with the purpose of starting World War III and destroying the commies before they can violate our precious bodily fluids.
And the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
This is the crux of the entire film, a scenario that Kubrick, Peter George, and Herman Kahn all believed was entirely too possible. Was it truly possible? Maybe, but we'll talk about that later. For now, the higher-ups learn quickly that a B-52 wing is storming into Russia fast, and it's time to act. General Buck Turgidson, along with dozens of military brass, end up in the war room with the president. But General Turgidson has a different idea. Why not, instead of trying in vain to recall the planes, they instead let them go and send reinforcements? The US would have the jump on the commies, and the war was basically inevitable.
We were to immediately launch an all-out and coordinated attack on all their airfields and missile bases. We'd stand a damn good chance of catching them with their pants down.
Only the president doesn't buy it, and orders Turgidson to recall the planes and storm Burleson Air Force Base and arrest General Ripper. But there's a problem. Wing Attack Plan R includes the stipulation that the planes should not retreat unless an extremely specific code is sent, one that only General Ripper knows. The president, in a desperate attempt to avoid nuclear war, invites the Soviet ambassador to the war room to see the big board and jointly figure out how to stop the attack. And when General Ripper chooses the way of the samurai, it looks like the only option is to divulge the targets of the dispatched B-52s and assist the Russians in shooting them down. But the pilots are just too good, and they manage to dodge the Russian SAMs and press on. However, in the end, Mandrake is able to deduce Ripper's recall code from his crazed doodling, and the B-52s finally receive their orders to return to base. Thank goodness. Only, there's a problem. One of the B-52s, under the command of Major Kong, sustained radio damage while evading a SAM strike. They never received their recall codes, and Kong has set their Stratofortress on a hard deck scraping run toward their target, ensuring that at least one nuke will hit its mark. And that would be bad enough, but remember the narrator's opening? The ambassador, with the aid of the titular Dr. Strangelove, explained to the president that the Russians finished their doomsday device after all, a sort of super deterrent that would literally destroy the entire world if Russia receives a direct hit from a nuclear bomb. Of course, the quirky German scientist makes it clear that the only way such a deterrent actually works is if you tell the world, something the Soviet premier hadn't done yet, wishing to make his announcement more grandiose.
The whole point of the doomsday machine is lost. If you keep it a secret, why didn't you tell the world, eh?
The movie ends with the iconic bomb riding scene, followed by a discussion amongst the military and political higher-ups about what essentially amounts to the Vault-Tec scheme from Fallout, in which all the important people go underground and wait out the apocalypse. Finally, after Dr. Strangelove announces a miracle recovery from his paralysis, the film hard cuts to a chilling montage of nuclear detonation footage set against Vera Lynn's "We'll Meet Again." So, being totally honest and a bit more off the cuff, I really hate it when anybody tries to examine comedy and say why something is funny. And in that spirit, I'm not going to try to tell you watching why Dr. Strangelove is so hilarious. With that said, the movie is obviously a farce, meaning that it takes real-life scenarios and exaggerates certain elements for comedic effect. And if I could break my own rule once right now and never again, the reason I find the movie so funny is that it barely exaggerates anything. Yep, with the exception of certain wacky character qualities and the existence of an actual doomsday device, Dr. Strangelove is incredibly real in its setups and scenarios. Let's start with the easy stuff. The United States Strategic Air Command did indeed maintain nuclear-armed flights airborne 24/7 from 1960 to 1968. These routes were designed for quick ingress towards specifically picked targets in the Soviet Union, all directed under the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or PSYOP for short. It is also true that in the event of a decapitating nuclear strike, again meaning there is no higher-ups to issue commands, pre-delegated lower-level SAC personnel could order a retaliatory strike. And yes, the prospect of recalling the B-52s once the order went out was dubious to say the least. This was sort of by design too, as there were fears of false recalls from the Soviets, and the pilots were required to continue their bombing runs unless told to come home. And while it is tough to say if one wing commander would have had such a code, or if the code was more universal, it was indeed true that it was heavily encrypted for security. With all of that in mind, it is reasonable to assume that such a mistake was possible as described in the film, with one or two caveats. The most important caveat has to do with something that Kubrick, for all of his obsessive research, might not have known when he wrote the screenplay. And that's the sweeping reforms implemented by the Kennedy administration to make nukes more secure. Things like the centralization of nuclear control took the nukes out of the hands of lower-level officers, meaning that aircrews would have to wait for official orders authorized by the president himself before acting. And in the event of a decapitation strike, those orders would still need to come from a specific group of very high-up people, like SINSAC or somebody similar. In addition, PAL codes were implemented, that is, permissive action links, that added a physical barrier to nuclear weapons that had never existed before. With the PAL codes, a certified representative of the Atomic Energy Commission would have to input a specific code for each individual weapon before it could be armed for an attack. And that all sounds really good, right? Only the necessity of pre-delegation as a contingency against a surprise attack meant that, just like every other responsibility in the chain of command, the retaliatory strike order could indeed be passed down the line even to a wing commander. The odds of this happening were extremely slim, but the specifics are still highly classified, and it is difficult to imagine a robust set of measures that could prevent a scenario as described in the film. Though, to be completely fair to the US Air Force, it is impossible to know for sure if those dominoes could truly have fallen so catastrophically. We just don't know enough about the classified procedures, even today. And to Kubrick's credit, the odds of a terrible accident happening was certainly much greater during the 1950s, before the Kennedy reforms took place. Another little caveat was the proposed fallout shelter network discussed in the film's final act. While such a system had been considered, and had even been implemented in the 50s, though half-heartedly, there was never such a plan fully implemented in the US. And the reasons are a little complicated. Firstly, there's the monetary question. It would have been extremely expensive to even preserve a sample size from the American population, and that darned freedom of ours would have had thousands of Americans wondering and probably yelling about who would qualify to be protected. And not every city would have been able to afford such a massive civil project. The next reason is much more arcane and frustrating. Many believe, for good reason mind you, that the principle of mutually assured destruction was the only thing that surely prevented full-scale conflict between the US and USSR during the Cold War. To put it simply, MAD refers to the idea that neither side would ever want to start a nuclear conflict with the other because they would most certainly be destroyed in response. Neither side could guarantee anything other than a Pyrrhic victory, so the only winning move would be not to play, to quote another movie.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play.
What does this have to do with civil defense shelters? Well, MAD was understood to be a very real, extremely effective deterrent to not just nuclear war, but any sort of conflict between the US and Russia. But it could only really work if that destruction was truly mutual. So while the Thorium-G doomsday device would certainly have been considered a balance shifter, even fallout shelters would have been construed as an unbalanced advantage for whoever built them successfully. The idea being, whoever could effectively defend land and citizenry would have an excuse to go for the Alpha Strike. And that's, bad.
Really?
Okay, I guess that wasn't a little caveat, but anyway, almost everything else about this movie is based in fact, and that's freaking horrifying. And Kubrick didn't stop at just broad-stroke story beats. The character General Turgidson is said to have been based heavily on Curtis LeMay, as was General Ripper. LeMay was a polarizing figure. Right from the start of his rapid rise to Air Force brass, LeMay was a hard-nosed, seemingly merciless warrior. From his dashing leadership in the European bombing campaigns, right up to his extremely controversial firebombing raids in Japan. Only, during the war, not many people were willing to challenge the guy who was absolutely rocking a very hated enemy. But warriors like LeMay often find stiff resistance during peacetime, and his blunt persona and near total lack of charm made him a favorite target for critics in the 1960s. LeMay would even clash with JFK and his staff when they started to soften America's nuclear stance. I plan to do a biographical video on LeMay to dig deeper into this figure, but the two characters in Dr. Strangelove succinctly portray what some in the public thought of him. And please don't hear me saying I agree with that perception completely. LeMay is not a simple figure, and there are lots of ins and outs to his story that help shape a better understanding of the caveman in a jet bomber. In fact, for as much as I love this movie, it is probably responsible for a very unfair painting of the man. But boy, is it sure funny.
I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but I do say no more than 10 to 20 million killed, tops, depending on the breaks.
Now that we've gone over the real-life scenarios presented by the film and some of the more obvious satire, let's go a bit deeper and examine the more subtle undertones of the setting. Well, subtle might not be the right word. Like many in the mid-century were wont to do with those in power, Kubrick shaped much of his perception of the men involved in nuclear affairs through a blatantly sexual lens. From the opening scenes of mid-air refueling and the phallic imagery of a Gloster Meteor jet fighter affixed with a drogue refueling probe, Kubrick had made his penchant for innuendo fairly obvious. This continues with names like Jack D. Ripper and Turgid's son, and is piled on heavily with that same Turgidson's comical relationship with the beautiful Miss Scott, his secretary and the only woman in the whole movie. Even Major Kong is seen ogling that same Miss Scott in a Playboy centerfold during his introduction to the story. So impervious is this penchant for innuendo that one could even pin the impetus for the film's plot, and that plot's resolution, on sex and sexual frustration. Firstly, General Ripper is oddly preoccupied with the safeguarding of precious bodily fluids against spoiling by the nefarious actions of communists. And why such a strange obsession? Well, firstly, it is plot proof that Ripper is indeed a nutjob, but under the surface, it reveals the frustrations of a strong, stoic man in the face of loosening sexual mores and the emasculating defeat of impotence.
I first became aware of it, Mandrake, during the physical act of love. Yes, a profound sense of fatigue, feeling of emptiness followed.
Ripper reveals this to Mandrake, with the general having originally blamed himself for his awkward coital catastrophe, before settling on commies as the real culprit.
Luckily, I was able to interpret these feelings correctly. Loss of essence.
Kubrick, in this underlying theme, seems to be implying that Ripper wants to wipe out Russia because, well, he couldn't stand to attention when duty called. And of course, like his real-life inspiration, Ripper is constantly chomping on a cigar, that's so Freudian a symbol for sexual frustration. In the film's conclusion, when Dr. Strangelove outlines the plan to hide away underground to preserve a sample of humanity, the leaders of the world seem oddly relieved, and even excited. Why? Well, because the Doctor informs them that they would need to procure as many as 10 attractive, breeding-age women for every man. Every one of these men, we might assume, have families, wives, sons, daughters, but none of that seems to matter in the face of such a bacchanalian fantasy.
Oh, let me have just a little bit of Farrell. No, doesn't help.
In fact, author Peter Kramer even points out that not a single man in the entire film ever references family or spouse, even as the world hinges on the brink of destruction. Pretty wild, huh? There are many other examples of innuendo and sexual references in the film, and each one is 100% intentional. Kubrick, perhaps aided by the famously irreverent Terry Southern, wove a tapestry of sexually adjacent references along a coital narrative structure, beginning with Turgidsson's countdown to blastoff and ending with the heavily suggestive riding of an H-bomb to a literal and figurative climax. Once this is pointed out, it is very hard to ignore. Though, if I could indulge in some subjective critique, I feel the sexual angle is maybe just a teensy bit reductive.
There is only sex. Everything is sex.
I often find preoccupation with sex to be an anemic philosophical explanation for the actions of the powerful. It is, I feel, a sort of cheap attempt at relating the motivations of the exceptional to the mundane, a kind of everybody poops but for adults. With that said, far be it from me to suppose my view is universal, and I think the sexual angle is one that many find all the more compelling. And hell, maybe nuclear devastation really is a sort of last gasp in the intercourse of existence. Or maybe it isn't. As usual, I encourage you to make of all of this what you will. To wrap things up, I want to talk about the initial response to the film, the official response to the film, and finally, the legacy of the movie. To start with, it was polarizing from the start, with even the very studio that produced it distancing itself from the film over concerns that it was too un-American. Some critics also felt it was too flippant regarding its ultra-serious subject matter, and even others felt the humor was downright inappropriate. But nobody could deny the talent from the cast, crew, and especially the director. Kubrick struck a scalding hot iron with a biting commentary during a time when it could not have been more relevant. Audiences were tuned in to all things nuclear thanks to the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 years earlier, and that same anxiety followed them into theaters in 1964. More receptive critics praised its humor, and Time magazine even described it as the most shattering sick joke of our time. And of course, there was also praise for Sellers' triple roll and the expert deadpan from Sterling Hayden. Oftentimes, great art is not the universally loved, but the divisive and controversial, and in its time, Dr. Strangelove epitomized that trait. It seems the perception today is that it was loved by those that understood it, and hated and maligned by all the right people. And today, the movie stands as Kubrick's most highly acclaimed work on Rotten Tomatoes, and features on many lists of greatest films of whatever. Honestly, it's hard to find a movie so critically loved, and contrarian that I can sometimes be, I totally agree. The critical consensus on the Decaying Fruit site states Stanley Kubrick's brilliant Cold War satire remains as funny and razor-sharp today as it was in 1964, and I couldn't agree more. The circumstances today are quite different, but the stakes are the same, and it's darkly hilarious how little things have truly changed. But you know who didn't appreciate it? The US Air Force, that's who. In fact, in addition to requesting the disclaimer mentioned before, they even went so far as to release an entire documentary on the safety and stringent checks involved in the release of nuclear weapons. SAC Command Post was a multiple-part series that had actually started in 1959. It is made up of 3 different documentaries, with the last one being created in 1963 as a direct response to works like Failsafe, novels and speculation similar to Red Alert, and of course the forthcoming Dr. Strangelove. The films predictably portray the Airborne Alert program as a necessary and extremely effective deterrent, and heavily stress the control of nuclear weapons by the president, not the military. The film was never given a wide release, but it was shown to military, academic, and civic groups by the Air Force itself. These documentaries are fascinating, and I myself have a lot of respect for SAC, but as I mentioned above, the issue of pre-delegation was never discussed, remaining a big, super secret secret throughout the Cold War. And just to return to that disclaimer, there is a strong argument to be made that despite the calming intention behind it, the Air Force's explainer had the exact opposite effect. By even acknowledging Kubrick's farce, the Air Force was already giving audiences reason to be suspicious. Why even bother if everything was so safe? Why even try to refute what is obviously fiction unless it really was possible? The disclaimer was added at the 11th hour when early screenings had already begun, but I can only imagine the delight of Kubrick and his fellows when they were able to include the matter-of-fact, frankly desperate-seeming blurb in front of their satire. It was simply too perfect. I've gone over the particulars of SAC and Airborne Alert in more detail in my Broken Arrow series, so if you want to know more about it, go check those out. But suffice it to say, the chance described in Dr. Strangelove was obviously remote, but almost certainly possible. In the end, though, it can be argued that Kubrick wasn't simply trying to scare his audience by revealing a gap in the dragon's scales.
Not simply the prospect of nuclear annihilation, not simply, but also by the way that people accepted it fatalistically, that that's probably how the world was going to end.
In his writings during early production, he described Westerners under the threat of nuclear war as inmates in a concentration camp, totally resigned to their fate, shambling around as if the sword of Damocles wasn't at their throats. Kubrick was not unrealistic, and he recognized the reality that total disarmament was, and is, a complete impossibility. So one could not even call his effort activism or even protest. Simply put, Kubrick wanted people to recognize the danger and make sure our leaders know that we know the stakes. Why? Because he believed that even complete disarmament would not work unless the hearts and minds of men could change. His hope, it seems, was to provide that first step toward change, recognizing the problem. The message of this film is without question relevant and sharply pointed at every nuclear-armed country today. As the firestorms rage and the mushroom cloud rises, as our leaders save themselves when the world starts falling apart, those of us who remember will hear that happy old song in our heads, praying against fate that we will meet again somewhere, sometime, some sunny day. Hey everybody, I'm going to keep this brief because it actually hasn't been that long since I've released a video. This movie is one of my favorite movies of all time. I absolutely love it. It's probably one of the more meaningful art pieces that I've ever examined, so that means there's a lot more like subtlety. I went over the kind of sexual aspect of the film that's a bit more blatant, but there's other stuff that I think is really interesting that I could go over in more detail. If anybody's interested in that sort of thing, just go ahead and leave a comment, and I'll dig into that more. Also, speaking of comments and likes, please be sure to leave a comment and a like, or a dislike even, if you've watched this video. It really, really helps push the video towards the top of the algorithm, just so more people can pick it up and see it. And of course, I launched my Patreon. I've got a few wonderful new members on there. There's not a whole lot of tiers right now or incentives, but I plan to add more very soon. So if you guys want to check that out, follow the link in the description, and I would really, really appreciate it. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.